Hi, good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to everyone. And welcome to Cultural Encounters, South Asian History in the Third Space. This is the Asia Society Indian Center's annual summer learning series, which is taking place virtually over June and July. And so, over 4 sessions, experts will be exploring the ways in which cultural similarities and interactions have shaped South Asia. And I think today we're very lucky to be with a group with roots in Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. So my name is Saba Imtiaz. I'm a Pakistani writer, and I'm currently based in the Netherlands. And joining us today are Sonal Ved, who is a group digital editor based in Bombay, India, and she was the first, actually she's in Mumbai, sorry. Very old habits, but not die hard. And she's a group digital editor based in Mumbai, and she was the first food editor at Vogue India. And she's author of cookbooks such as Tiffin and Indian Vegan, as well as the Amazon bestseller Whose Samosa Is It Anyway? A line so good that I wish I'd stolen it for myself. And she's been writing for publications such as The Guardian, Savoir, Food 52, and Thrillist. And she's also hosted a cooking show for Tastemade. Our other panelist today is Dina Begum. She is a wonderful British Bangladeshi author and food writer, and whose new book, Made in Bangladesh, will send you straight to the store to buy mustard oil and dried red chilies, like guaranteed. She's based in London and has written for publications such as Whetstone Magazine, Delicious, and Food 52. She's also a member of the Guild of Food Writers, and her first book, The Brick Lane Cookbook, was published in 2013. And yeah, so we're very excited to be here with both Sonal and Dina. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to a very fun conversation and just very excited to be talking about Desi food. Sonal, in the last few years, I feel like there's definitely been a shift, in terms of food writing, with sort of cliches being called out and corrected by readers, especially in international publications. And there's just so much more nuanced food writing that is coming from places like Pittles about not just, Indian food as a blanket statement, but kind of regional food and practices. And sort of people are really pushing back against things that you would see sort of taken for granted in writing about India, which was like, oh, everyone here is a vegetarian, or everyone in Pakistan eats red meat. And, so Sonal, for example, for you, from your perspective as the author of cookbooks and somebody who writes about food, how do you see the identity of Indian food changing, both at home as well as internationally? And how do you see kind of your role in documenting all of this?
While that's happening in American and British press predominantly, where cliches are being called out and authenticity is being questioned and all of that, when I talk about Indian food in India, I think we've moved miles away, whether it's in restaurants or whether it's with the way media is reporting Indian food. No one now considers North Indian food as a hallmark of Indian cuisine, which is what something we did a while ago, and everybody wants to go deeper, understand it more. There is differentiation and understanding of the differentiation between, say, the way curry is made in Pakistan versus Bangladesh versus India versus Nepal. So even within our own subcontinent, we're still questioning how we are doing things differently and being excited about it, right? For example, even if you take something as simple as a dosa, first it was understood when you say dosa, it belongs to somewhere in South India, but now we'll say like a Bene style from Karnataka, a Mysore set dosa, a masala dosa, ragi dosa, pesaratu, which is another kind of crepe from Andhra Pradesh. These nuances are very interesting suddenly to understand. And I feel like this public excitement is also being reflected in restaurants because they are also trying to do versions of this within their restaurants on tasting menus. So, definitely, there is a certain kind of a movement, and Indian food is at the brink of this movement. When it comes to food journalism per se, I think we're no longer, dumbing down Indian food for people. We're calling things as is and letting people do their own research and read more. Things like that. I think there's this sense of encouragement even within the way writers are writing about Indian food, the kind of pitches I'm getting. They're expecting the reader to be a lot more evolved now because there's so much work done to kind of prove that Indian food is beyond butter chicken and naan and samosas and things like that, right? And while international media may still be struggling, correct me if I'm wrong, Sabha, but I feel like we're so particular about every kind of nuance right now. Like, for example, we'll talk with more depth about gender, about ethnicity, about origin of certain rituals, about ingredients. There's so much of responsibility now while we are reporting. And where I see myself contribute is as an editor. I'm trying to encourage more and more writing and writers who want to talk with a lot of I would say, integrity and a lot of depth about any subject versus kind of, just, brush upon a subject and then move on to the next best thing. So that's what I feel. I hope you got the answer to what you were asking.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's like a perfect segue to talk to somebody who is doing this, which is Dina. Dina, I really wanted to hear from you, especially because for a long time, especially abroad, I guess, Indian food was Pakistani and Bangladeshi food was always lumped into like sort of one category, right? And I think maybe there's been a bit more on Pakistani food, but yeah, separating Bangladeshi cuisine from Indian and Pakistani, there have been a lot of struggles and stereotypes, of course. And I'm really curious about how you see your work and being able to do that, because obviously I think when you already enter a room, there must be so many stereotypes that people already have. Like you're from South Asia, so you must be writing
Yes.
about X or Y, or you must be doing that work.
It definitely was a challenge. I mean, when I started writing full time about food about 10 years ago, I think there was very little in English anyway, internationally written about Bangladeshi food. So when I started writing about things, people were kind of, isn't this the same? I had a lot of, typical comments, isn't this the same as Indian food? Or this looks kind of like what we have. But, you know, visually, a lot of Bangladeshi food, a lot of South Asian food can look similar and have overlaps, obviously, but the way they're cooked and the ingredients used are totally different and can transform a dish or change depending on what ingredients you use and how it's cooked. So I think it was all kind of lumped together, like you're saying, in as Indian cuisine. So I think I didn't see people kind of um, just I think about 10 years ago, that's probably just when I thought, anyway, from the UK, people were starting to get interested in more regional South Asian cuisine. And in particular, that's the time I think there's a huge change in Indian cuisine internationally. So people were kind of more interested in regional Indian cuisine, as well as kind of Pakistani cuisine. There was the book by Sumaya Usmani that came out, I think not so long after that. And that was a huge kind of revelation to me because I thought this is really amazing and I'd love to do this equally for Bangladeshi cuisine, because for the first time I saw Pakistani cuisine kind of spotlighted and all the kind of the country as a whole, which I didn't know much about in terms of food culture, was kind of presented by Sumaya. And I thought, it'd be great if people kind of saw Bangladeshi cuisine in this way. And when I wrote about Bangladeshi food at that time, it was kind of I wasn't getting kind of I guess on social media was a huge source of encouragement for me, because everybody on my Twitter or X, Instagram, were really kind of interested. I still write, a lot of kind of essays and articles on food and Bangladeshi food culture. So I think that encouraged me to explore Bangladeshi cuisine as a whole, because I thought people are definitely interested, and it's kind of goes against what I was told by publishers initially, that people wouldn't be interested, or this is too much like Indian food, or people wouldn't understand the cuisine. So these are a lot of things I was getting from publishers around that time, that people wouldn't want to know about this cuisine. And I thought that's just ridiculous, because it's so varied and so vast. Even within Bangladesh, there's so much I have to explore myself in terms of the cuisine, in terms of region and kind of local specialties and things like that. So it was a huge challenge. But over the years, I think after my first book, Brick Lane, was out, it's about 5 years now, 2018. That was a mixture of Bangladeshi as well as kind of diverse immigrant cuisines from Brick Lane, which is an immigrant hub. So that kind of gave me the motivation, in fact, to kind of focus more on just Bangladeshi food. So this book has been, since I was young, I wanted to write Made in Bangladesh. And so when I wrote this, the response has been kind of overwhelming. It's just been amazing that people really resonated with a lot of people, and people really kind of related to the stories, to the recipes, and shared a lot of the things that I shared. And I was hoping, they would love it as much as I do. But when people kind of reflect your own kind of ideas and memories and the ways of cooking, it just really kind of cements that idea that there is definitely a need for this. And this is, for me, and I hope generally, an important book, because we haven't had a Bangladeshi cookbook in the mainstream in English, like this before. So it's, an honor for me to write this and share this with everybody.
I'm curious about how, is there like when people would say these things to you that, oh, isn't it just like Indian cuisine, or it would be hard for people to understand? I mean, how do you respond to that other than giving them like a lecture on history from like the last 10,000 years?
It's, I think explaining kind of with a couple of brief examples. So I would say if anyone were to say to me, it's very difficult to say what's Bangladeshi cuisine, how does it differ from Indian cuisine or Pakistani cuisine, I would say, okay, fish and rice, two of the core staples, and then you have two of the food kind of traditions, which is borta, which is a mash, you know, of sorts you can make with vegetables, fish, meat even, and it's a huge, like hundreds of varieties of borta. So it's made with mustard oil, chilies, coriander. So like you have a bengan barta in kind of Indian and Pakistani cuisine, which is probably what I can compare it to. But then the vastness of borta in Bangladesh is kind of such a huge range, and that's a cornerstone of Bangladeshi cuisine. And also pita, which are rice-based sweets and savory. So those four items, I think, two kind of things: borta, pita, rice, and fish would be, I would say, if I were to kind of just give a general overview of Bangladeshi food, those would be the differentiating factors of Bangladeshi food compared to Indian or Pakistani.
Sonal, I'm really curious about the regional and international influences on street food, especially given your book. And I know I'm from Karachi, and we have, I mean, a ton of international influences, and of course influences from Bombay and other cities on cuisine in Karachi. You know, we have the idea of a burger, which I'm sure in Mumbai is like an aloo tikki, but we call it a bun kebab. We have regional influences from within Pakistan that go into the sandwich. And I'm curious whether you also see this kind of both within India, like influence on street food in Mumbai, especially now, as well as international food trends, because of course there is constant migration, whether that's from the Gulf and from within the country as well. And yeah, how is it changing now, particularly these years?
So firstly, we have to understand that Indian subcontinental food, I would say, is at least 4,000 years old. So of course, there is so much of revision happening every few hundreds of years, and the definition of Indian food is constantly changing. Right now, we're at this time where we're experiencing this colossal shift in our attitude towards Indian cuisine, even in India. So while earlier the concepts like chaat and kebab rolls were considered to be I would say down market, and it was meant for the streets and all of that. Now you are seeing chefs, fine dine Indian chefs, not only in India but in cities like New York and London, also serve versions of these Indian street food snacks in restaurants. So there is this revision in the concept of street food within itself. And when you take that same street food and go to the streets, I see that, immigration and what immigration has done to Indian food, that's just one aspect of it. There are so many factors that have kind of made Indian street food evolve. I'll first start with the burger in particular. Like you said, there are these burger style things, bun kebabs you mentioned in Karachi, which are very popular. So in India, what's happening is there is something called egg banjo, which is being sold in like a very small town in Madhya Pradesh, like central India, a place called Indore, which is known for street food. And they're doing a dish called egg banjo. And now it's a supremely popular dish. But when I was doing a little research on where this came from, apparently it's inspired by the British snack, which is egg banjo, which is like an egg sandwich, which originated somewhere around World War One. And now that dish is being sold in central India as something super unique, and everyone's eating it on the street. It's like an egg patty with spices. Of course, it has like an Indian version of this British snack, but you can't take away the fact that the inspiration has been British, right? So I feel like that kind of excitement has always been around Indian street food. I'll give you another example. There is something called Chinese bhel. Now, this originated somewhere around the Indo-Chinese exchange, which was happening by Hakka Chinese traders who settled in Calcutta in the late 1700s. And they used to fry noodles, and then the Indians thought of, let's spice it up and put things in it and all of that. And then was born an Chinese bhel. Like if you tell this to a Chinese person, they are going to be shocked how this exists. But it was a coming together of the Chinese and Indian cuisine and developed its own finer thing. So immigration, or like people who came to India, settled in India, whether it's the Portuguese, whether it's the Chinese, whether it's Dutch, whether it's British, they've all had their little influences, and then that sort of made Indian street food what it is today.
All of this sounds so delicious and so exciting that I kind of really want to, of course, one cannot jump on a plane. But Dina, I'm really curious. Do you see this also evolving when you're traveling in Bangladesh? And also, I'm kind of interested in how much of that do you see happening in Bangladeshi restaurants in the UK?
You mean in terms of street food in the
Yeah, or
UK,
just kind of
Bangladeshi
this,
food?
yeah, exactly. Or
Yeah.
just like these international influences kind of coming back. I'm
Sure.
really curious if there are like British origin Bangladeshi dishes that are now coming back to Dhaka, sort of in like a circular way.
Yeah, I guess there's a bit more of that now. I mean, I think the kind of exchange between Bangladeshi food, or particularly from Dhaka to the UK, has, only recently started to take off. So there hasn't been that much in terms of British food, Bangladeshi food going into Dhaka. But I have noticed in Dhaka street food, for instance, we've got more, puchka, chotpoti. Those are kind of street foods popular in Bangladesh, or shingara. Those three items that you wouldn't necessarily see on British menus, unless they're small cafes for kind of workers locally. Kind of coming into more cafes and eateries in London and around the UK. So I feel like definitely, people going there, filming things that they've eaten. There's definitely more travel into Bangladesh, in particular Dhaka and some of the other kind of main cities. So, whether it's Bangladeshi people or people from other places, and I've seen like kind of Indian, vloggers and people from the UK, white, British people going, Americans going, and filming things that they've eaten around Bangladesh. And I think that's definitely translating into them going back and making it, on social media, or, kind of putting it on their menu, for instance. So I've seen definitely that happening a bit more. So like other day I went and had puchka, at a local place in East London, and normally you wouldn't get so much of that. And now I'm seeing more and more coming up, more kind of Bangladesh influences, which is really nice to see in the UK. And similarly in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, last time I went, I've seen more of a celebration of Bangladeshi street food in the kind of mainstream or nicer kind of dining areas, just as it were, rather than just on the streets. So I think people are taking greater pride in terms of, representing their cuisine and showcasing their cuisine. And kind of, there isn't that thing, I think, in a lot of countries, especially, when we've been colonized, the British influence is there, or everyone wants to kind of become Western. Being Western is the modern thing, it's the done thing, when a lot of people are growing up. And now I think it's going back to the roots, reclaiming our heritage, culture, food heritage in particular. And food is such an easy way to kind of share that with the world. Nobody needs to learn the language or what anything is. You just taste something and it was delicious, then you kind of go and recreate it in some way. So I'm seeing, and that's really nice to see, because just like Sonal was saying, there's a Bangladeshi versions of Chinese food, of Thai food, and that's been really popular. Sushi, there's a lot of kind of influences from other areas in Bangladesh, and in particular street food. You've got even Indian street foods that's coming into Bangladesh, for instance, so not just Bangladeshi street food, but Indian Bangladeshi street food. So you've got bel and things like that you wouldn't find necessarily on the streets of Dhaka. Now you've got more of those, you've got dosas and things like that in Dhaka as well, which I didn't see until recently. So there's definitely, with travel, and social media, there's a lot more of sharing dishes, recreating dishes going on, as well as, I think it's like two things are happening. One thing is kind of, there's a huge influx of different cuisines, different flavors, kind of Korean, Eastern Asian kind of cuisines going into the street food scene, as well as kind of, I guess, taking a greater interest or showcasing original Bangladeshi food as well. So I'm seeing like two threads kind of at the moment that's been very important.
Yeah, and that's, I think, so exciting. And so much of it is, I think, also happening because of, as you said, because of social media, right? People going in. Like the other day, I wanted to fact check something about Lahore, and I found this vlog by a Sri Lankan traveler in Lahore, like looking around at things. And so it's just, it's kind of incredible how many narrators we have of street food culture now in both urban and rural parts of the region, which I don't think we had access to at all before. And I often see like all of these trends kind of like seep in from the streets of our major cities. In Pakistan, we had this absolutely bonkers trend, which I've seen like a bunch of videos of, but subtitled into Indian languages, which is this guy in Lahore who used to pour kind of a gallon of ghee onto any kind of food he was cooking, which is just like, and of course, people in Pakistan start copying it. And then I've seen videos of like people in India commenting on these, like this extremely great trend. So I'm curious about like, this of course, I'm sure you see it in your own work as well, of how much like the cultural encounters of Instagram and TikTok are shaping the way we look at food. I mean, we've always looked at cooking shows abroad and incorporated some of that. But Sonal, do you see this happening, the Instagramification or TikTokification of street food in India?
So before I get to that, Saba, I just want to add a point which I kind of wanted to say when Dina was talking about the whole fact that now there is Bangladeshi style puchka available on the streets of London. Now, while that is happening in its pure, authentic, original form, as Indians would know pani puri, in India, what's happening is people are obviously so bored of eating the same versions of it for centuries that now they're doing 6 different kinds of panis for the 6 puris that you get. So one will have raw mango, one will have tamarind, one will have mint leaves or whatever. So every pani is different because there's that sort of innovation happening here from what you originally would say is authentic Indian food. So while the world is now tasting what could be authentic to us, say 10 years ago, is now something else for us here. So that like I said before, that whole dialogue around what Indian food is changing, and it's going to obviously keep evolving. It always has for centuries. Now, coming back to your question, firstly, we don't have TikTok in India because TikTok is banned in India. What we have is Instagram, and what we're seeing are Instagram reels. So there is definitely a massive influence that TikTok or Instagram has on the street food, especially. I see that there is a region in India called Surat, which is in Gujarat, in the west, on the west coast of India. And in Surat, so Indore, Surat, these are all like big food pockets in India where people are a lot more experimental. And as if it's like LA, in Surat, you will see like random street stalls selling avocado toasts. Like it's so bizarre. Like I have obviously not grown up seeing that, so it's an anomaly even for me. And what they do is, and how they Indianize it is, they'll obviously put Indian cheese on it. It'll be like a proper sourdough, which is toasted with olive oil on like a pan, and then you have your Haas avocado, and I don't know where they're getting Haas avocados from. And then you have all your Indian spices going in there, and then you have like your proper sourdough toast, which is obviously the whole Instagramification of street food. And I've seen that, and I've also seen the blooming onion. When the onion is like dipped in a batter, and then when you fry it, it blooms. Now that's also something that I saw on some international reel, and that's now available on the streets of India. So these things come and go as and when there is something trend based. Of course, boba tea is so huge and is now available on these tiny little hole in the wall places. And that's all influence of international culture and cuisine. But is that something that's going to stick? Is something only time can tell, because it's very new to what we're experiencing.
Dina is somebody who is based in the UK and is writing and just wrote this book about historical Bangladeshi cuisine and recipes. How much like of the diaspora reaches out to you via Instagram and says, "Oh, I saw this recipe," or "My mother used to make this," or "I've heard about this from my family," and kind of are curious about food from there?
I've had a lot of messages. I think since the book's come out, it's literally, I've been inundated with messages from not just Bangladeshis in the diaspora, but other people as well who've been married into a Bangladeshi family or have actually lived or worked in Bangladesh. And that's been really heartening. And a lot of people have been kind of, for me, I pretty much grew up in the UK. I have visited Bangladesh, a couple of times, but I've been here since I was 4. So for me, I think a lot of people kind of have this kind of preconception that, if you've grown up abroad, you don't really necessarily know much about traditional Bangladeshi cuisine. For me, it was the fact that my family, in particular my parents and my grandmother, who I learned a lot from, were kind of very stringent on kind of teaching us, especially me, I'm the eldest of 5, traditional Bangladeshi, not just the cooking, but also the ingredients, where things come from. My dad used to be a huge kind of advocate for Bangladeshi literature, culture. So he taught me a lot, to my mother as well. So I grew up, in a house, we spoke just Bengali at home. We didn't speak English until like much later. Funnily enough, later on, my dad started speaking English, and I'd still respond in Bengali, because when we were growing up, his English outside the house, but Bengali inside the house. So it was very much kind of Bengali culture infused upbringing that I had. So I grew up seeing all of that. And I think when I didn't recognize the outside, it was really important for me to kind of put this into a book and share it with everybody. And so when people started telling me, I really kind of identify with what you've written here, this is how, I grew up cooking with my mum, or this recipe reminds me of my grandmother's recipe, that was all kind of, very touching, because I thought, I'm cooking from my perspective, and obviously, research, through family, through friends, when I visited Bangladesh as well. So I was kind of, I did my best in terms of researching everything. So I wanted to get it right. And I thought this is kind of my opportunity to kind of showcase this to the world. It's not just a book that people aren't familiar with the cuisine. So internationally anyway. So I wanted something that I could look at and be proud of, that anyone coming to Bangladeshi cuisine from any area, or kind of whether they're Bangladeshi or not, could kind of take something away and learn something. So it's not just the recipes that they cook, but also the food history. So that was really important to me. So when I shared these recipes, and people were kind of really identifying with the dishes that I shared, with the techniques that I shared, I knew, I must have done something right. So that was really, really good. And also a lot of people said they cooked the dishes and tasted the same or similar, which again, as dishes vary from region to region, family to family even. So when I tried my best to kind of, I guess, standardize a lot of things and pick a couple of dishes from each region. So I felt that it needed to be kind of representative, not just of, sometimes people look at a country, they think it's the capital, Dhaka is where it's at, it's just, or India, they look at kind of Delhi or Mumbai, but there's much more in terms of regional food and kind of local foods. And that's just the kind of a surface area of what I presented. There's so much more that's left to be discovered. So I tried to kind of incorporate all the different regions, and it's divided by seasons, so which is a huge part of the cultural landscape of Bangladeshi cuisine. So each of these kind of feed into the different 6 seasons of Bangladesh. So I wanted to get that so people could kind of relate to it, which hopefully they have. So yeah, that's kind of, I guess it was very nice to see that people did relate to the recipes and kind of came back and said that this was familiar, rather than what are you doing, what is this dish,
Yeah, I have to say, like, for me, I've never cooked Bangladeshi food. And I think even cooking from, I think one of the dishes that I cooked from your book, I thought, okay, I'm not going to compare this at all with Pakistani food. Like, this is not the same thing, because the cooking technique was completely different. Like anything that I would have done in a normal recipe, it was completely the opposite of that. And I was like, this is so interesting, because the final product kind of looks the same that I think the Pakistani dish would have looked like, but it tasted different. And the whole process of getting into it was so different that I had to really break a lot of my own stereotypes while cooking it and be like, trust Dina. Don't trust your own instincts of what you're supposed to do first. And speaking of research, Sonal, like that's one of the things that you did for your book, Whose Samosa Is It Anyway? And I know that there's obviously a lot of learning when you are doing archival research, especially in our region, about food, but how much of unlearning did you have to do about what you had already thought were kind of like, your idea of like, this is exactly where it came from, and this is the accepted origin story, and how many of these things were like new for you?
So, of course, a lot of it was like eye-opening for me. Like, for example, I'm a vegetarian. I grew up eating vegetarian food, and of course, your world revolves around your own food and your tiffin and your culture. And I always felt like, oh wow, Indian food has so much of vegetarian food. But then when I did more research, I realized that only about 39 to 40% of Indian food is vegetarian. It's this complete myth that's even outside saying, oh, Indian food is only vegetables and dal and paneer and things like that. But it's not. Indian food is so nuanced. It has so many meat eating regions, and it has such a big, I would say, catalog of meat recipes. So I think that was one thing that kind of I had to change. Also, Indian food has more than spices. Firstly, we don't have just one spice. Secondly, we have not just spice. There's so much more to Indian food, which is like the entire region of Northeast Indian food, which is not, barely even spoken about in Indian restaurants in India. Forget internationally, because it'll come at some point. Is they rely on so many fresh greens and herbs to flavor their food, which is a very European way of cooking, I would say. So, those are certain things that I didn't know about my own cuisine. Then I had this interesting fact that, this political leader called, a national leader called Rabindranath Tagore, he was, according to me, the first food influencer of India, because he was, in one place he was, talking about politics and all of that, but he was such a big foodie that he used to go through these phases in life where he would be like, I just want to eat all things cauliflower. So then the whole Tagore kitchen would be just making things with cauliflower, including a barfi that they made, barfi, which is an Indian sweet that they made using a cauliflower. I would have never known this had it not been for the research of my book. I saw him, he was such a great writer. Of course, you all are familiar with the fact that he wrote poetries and all of that, but he also wrote copy for Cadbury, which is like the chocolate of the Indian subcontinent or whatever. So, these were these bits that came about. There is an Indian snack, South Indian snack called sundal, which is basically, some kind of chickpeas or peanuts, sprinkled with coconut. Now, I read, and even if today you get off at Chennai airport, you can straight get into somebody selling sundal and filter coffee. But this goes back to like thousands of years during the Chola period, where a Chola prince was, depicted eating that sundal in a poetry from the Chola period. So I would never imagine that these links went so back, like so behind. And it's only through this research that I realized that. And funnily, I had just completed a book called Tiffin, which was 500 Indian recipes. At that point, and I straight jumped into researching for this book. And had I done the research for this book before I wrote Tiffin, I think I would have definitely had more than 1,000 recipes and not just 500. So that was, I'm more than unlearning. I feel like I learned a lot.
I was just going to, while you were talking, I was thinking, how much do we have to thank the Tagore family for things that are not poetry? Because they're also to do with how we wear, like the modern sari is also like thanks to the Tagore family's women. And yeah, clearly, I guess if we started doing research in a bunch of other areas, we would discover their influence on every like sort of modern aspect of our life. But yeah, I think for me also, I started looking into the roots of this very popular drink we have in urban Karachi, as well as in some of urban Punjab, which is milk mixed with 7-Up. And I had kind of always thought that this was like a completely Punjabi innovation, and that of course, like, we just mix these two things together. And when I looked it up, when I started researching it, I realized it actually came from the Victorian era, and that there was no Punjabi involved in making it. And it's so weird, like you look at these things that you take for sort of common everyday use, and you think they must have come from our own imagination, and they haven't. But Dina, in terms of researching for your book, how much of it came from, sort of this oral tradition and oral encounters with members of your family? As you said, you were taught to cook early on. And did you have to rely on other people in the community for anecdotes or how to get a recipe right?
So most of it was kind of, I guess, I started writing recipes from my teens, and collecting things. And obviously a lot of it was passed down, orally. So in terms of writing recipes, it's not a thing, you learn by antaz or andaz, by, feeling and seeing how things look and sensory kind of experience of cooking. And that's how my mum taught me to cook. And actually my dad as well, when I was younger, he loved meat curries. So, meat curries I learned from my dad, I would say predominantly. So, and it was kind of, I guess one of the things that I kind of had to unlearn was writing the recipes down, measuring things, weighing things, like weighing, measuring, timing things, and just all these things that we don't normally do or naturally do when it comes to cooking. So you just kind of, you know roughly how much of anything, everything is, and you kind of go by eye, and so that was for me a bit tricky to kind of begin doing that. And then a lot of the traditional family recipes that the things that my mum taught me or my grandmother taught me, it was such a challenge trying to kind of get them to stand by, my side and kind of, see how things should look and how, kind of how much of this, how much of that, and time things. And a lot of the times my mum was standing next to me and I'm like, so, how much of this should I use? And she's like, just this much, as usual, or how long should this cook? And it's trying to kind of get her input as well as kind of write things down without, the thing that was really important to me was not to kind of dull down the flavors. I wanted everything to be exactly as we cook it and exactly as they should be. So I didn't kind of, dull down the chilies or anything like that, the spices, the way things are cooked. So I'd always put a note in, you can always reduce the heat if you can't tolerate the heat, but I wanted it to be exactly traditional and or I guess authentic to us, or how we learn to cook it. So that was kind of one of the things that was really important to me because, again, I think I felt a little bit of pressure in terms of, okay, nobody's really written a book like this, so I wanted things to be right as much as I could, get them, right. And so writing things down was challenging. And then even researching, I guess a lot of the things were, family recipes, speaking to my aunts throughout the whole process, my late grandmother, who sadly didn't see the book, materialize, or my dad actually, who passed away during the time of the book, making of the book. But there's a lot of things I learned from my family, extended family, as well as family friends, and people kind of I grew up around, because we had growing up, we went to people's houses for dawats, and they came over to ours. So there's a lot of shared recipes, slight differences in cooking techniques and styles. But overall, I think it kind of stemmed down to, I guess, one of the things I wanted to do was I don't know if you guys have seen, Chef's Table on Netflix, and Turkish chef Musta Devran, his episode, he said one of the important factors in kind of showcasing a cuisine or, a food history is to put down the foundation of that cuisine, and then you can do whatever you like. You can do modern versions, you can do traditional recipes, but you have to have the foundation of that cuisine down. And I thought that's really important, that I don't want people to lose the basic recipes, the traditional recipes, the things that everyone's grandmother, great grandmother cooked for hundreds of years, thousands of years. And I wanted those to be down exactly as they should. Obviously, there's a couple of modern variations, but it was important to be as true to the original as possible. So that meant obviously speaking to a lot of the elders in the community and kind of getting their input in how they would cook things or how things were made. And I didn't want to change the techniques a lot. Obviously, living in the UK, I was mindful of the fact that a lot of the ways some things were cooked would have to be kind of altered. For instance, you wouldn't use the pestle and more traditional shil butter, the flat slab of stones you have, in South Asia with the rolling stone. So you'd use a spice grinder, for instance, or you'd use a food processor where need be. But I didn't want to alter that too much, just kind of adapt it a little bit according to the modern kitchen, but keep the techniques as traditional and the ingredients as traditional as possible. So yeah, that just meant kind of getting everyone's kind of input and ideas and just going back to how I cooked things when I was growing up, not to, I guess, how things have been adapted. Because even when we came to the UK, my mother had all those traditional kind of kitchen utensils and things that she used in the kitchen. So I grew up seeing all of that and how those were used. So I wanted to kind of replicate that as much as possible.
That's incredible. I also was just thinking about, when parents or elders tell you recipes and how kind of you're meant to use your own mind, and there's not, there's a lot of like, of course, andaza, but my father recently sent me a recipe and the last line is count to 5. And I was just like, what do you mean count to 5? It's just like, after you count to 5, then it's done. It's like, but how I felt like I was in that Friends episode where it's like, is it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi? Like, what speed am I counting to 5 on? But I think this is like the South Asian, like, yeah, just like do it by eye. I once made my aunt's cook like tried to tell me his recipe for kheer, and to him it was completely like anathema that I was asking him in like tablespoons, and it was just like, but it's just a cup of rice, like how can you measure it out? This is like the strangest thing you're making me do.
I think
Dina,
Sabha, one of the funniest thing, because when I was writing Tiffin, my publisher made me write the book with an American audience in mind. And, the thing that we take most for granted, which is what we eat every day, is a chapati. And she said, no, but you need to specify how many spoons of flour do you need to make a chapati. And I swear, that was the hardest thing I have done my whole life, because I had to actually measure how many, spoons of flour I was taking, because chapati is so thin, right? It's literally a few spoons. And we did that, and then I realized that now I know that it takes one heaped tablespoon to make one chapati, and I'm never going to forget that math all my life.
Yes, but you see, I would ask as somebody who is not good at cooking, would be like, how heaped? Like, is that mountain heaped or just like a normal sized heaped? And so this is why I should not ever write a cookbook, because I would be a complete disaster. I think we're going to head into questions in a few minutes. Dina, I was going to ask you, why did you structure it around seasons, your book?
I guess the number one thing was I mean, a lot of, not just Bangladeshi cuisine, a lot of South Asian cuisines, a lot of cuisines, eat seasonally. But seasonality is so important because not only is it eating seasonally, but eating seasonally with the kind of local ingredients that you have. And obviously I've just kind of, like I said, scratched the surface of, the greens and herbs. Sonal was saying there's a lot of greens and herbs that are used locally in a lot of South Asian cuisines and regions. And just like that, Bangladesh as well, there's a lot of things that locally that's used in different parts of Bangladesh. Bangladesh also is neighboring Myanmar, Burma, and there's a lot of Southeast Asian influences coming in, as well as the Mughal and Persian influences, some British influence as well. So when you go from the northern part of Bangladesh to the southern part, it's kind of huge differences in terms of spices used, ingredients used, and seasonality has a lot to do with that in terms of what's available. We have the famous shatkora in the Sylhet region where I'm from, which is a bittersweet aromatic, kind of very aromatic citrus. If you've had it, you'll know. I really urge you to try it. It's just amazing with meat dishes, and with dal, you can put in dal as well as fish. And it's one of the things that was, when I grew up, I read about the 6 seasons in Bengali textbooks. We went to Bangla class, after school on the weekends. And it's something that my dad always talked about, the harvest seasons, the summers, the monsoon, the kind of autumn seasons where you make a lot of the pita, which are the rice-based sweets and savours made with the freshly kind of milled rice, because it's harvest season. So that's kind of a celebration around that harvest season. The celebrations for everything, literally, and 6 seasons. Each of the season has multiple, celebrations. And I grew up seeing that, seeing the kind of illustrations in these textbooks, as well as my dad talking about it. There was, poetry, songs, lots of things around the food and the seasons, and it was always intertwined. And we'd have lots of celebrations for everything, kind of literally, it's Bangladesh is called Bare Mashe Tero Parbon, which is 13 months in 13 festivals in 12 months, which is kind of telling us kind of the multitude of festivals that you have in the year, because it's just beyond the kind of the 12 months. So I think for me, it was just trying to center it around something that was kind of nostalgic for me, as well as something that was culturally kind of appropriate, because I just thought, it just goes in with feeds into the way we eat, and also I thought it's a nice way to structure the book, because it's not just vegetarian meat, fish, dessert. It's something that also brings in the cultural elements of Bangladeshi food culture and food history. So you see the different things that happen around the seasons, the celebrations, the special foods that we eat during the seasons, and the special ingredients that we have during the season. So I thought that would be kind of a good way to kind of group the seasons, as well as the food and the festivities, because it wasn't for me, it's not just a book of recipes, it's a book of culture, the vibrancy and the joy of Bangladeshi cuisine, and just Bangladesh generally. So I had elements of the traditional fabrics, traditional kind of props and things that I've used. If you've noticed, like in the book, there's lots of different elements and lots of different touches that I put to kind of showcase the culture, not just the food culture, but the culture of Bangladesh and the history of Bangladesh, which is very important. So which is why, yeah, I guess 6 seasons.
Yeah, and no, I think it makes the book a much more fascinating read for it. And Sonal, since we only have you for like a few more minutes, I was wondering if we could start with one of the questions, and then we could say goodbye.
Yes, sure. Sorry, I have to leave early today. So my apologies to everybody out here to hear me. I'm super grateful, and this was an extremely fun chat, Dina. Is there a specific question you would like me to take, or can I pick one?
If you can pick one, but I thought maybe the most recent one would be something that might be interesting to you.
How do you feel
Or
about
that, or the corrupted versions of street foods?
I think we kind of addressed that whole corrupted versions of street food. I was having this chat with an Indian chef whose work I really enjoy. His name is Ranveer Brar, And I always used to tell him that, Ranveer, how do you should look, if you're not familiar with his work, please look it up on Instagram or on YouTube. And he does a lot of Indian recipes, both modern and traditional. And I said, how do you at one end talk about every small nuance that goes into making a biryani, which has 120 steps, but at the same time, you will also, do dosa filled with momos, which is something I think somebody in the comment box has asked. And he said something really interesting. He said that there is space for both kinds of chefs. There will always be people who will want to preserve traditional recipes, which is what I tried to do with my cookbook. And I think even what Dina is trying to do. We are trying to preserve these recipes so that they're there, like they're there for people to cook if that's the style of food that they want. But unfortunately, evolution, or whatever you want to call it, is something that we're not going to be able to stop, because as more and more ingredients begin to come into any cuisine or any land, people are going to experiment with it. I'll give you an example. Indian cuisine does not have the concept of macaroni, but there is a Sindhi dish which is called macaroniul patata, which is basically a sabji made out of macaroni and potatoes and spices. Now, this happened because the Sindhi traders were extremely affluent and they started moving out of India. They used to bring back ingredients, and then their wives or people cooking in their homes started experimenting with it. Now, this recipe must be in Indian cuisine for, say, 20 years, 30 years or so, but it has now become a part of Indian cuisine. So you don't know what sticks and then kind of lasts. Some things will fade away because they just don't make any sense to the cuisine. The ingredient availability is, there's a shortage and things like that. But then there will be things which will kind of stay, and only time can decide, or the palate will decide.